Today we're continuing our look in the book of Psalms. There are so many that I really would have liked to got through, but I think the Lord is moving us on. But I do want to spend some time looking at this Psalm, Psalm 58. If you have your copy of Scriptures, I'd like to read it from the New English Translation. For the music director, according to the Al-Tashesh style, a prayer of David. Do you rulers really pronounce just decisions? Do you judge people fairly? No. You plan how to do what is unjust. You deal out violence in the earth. The wicked turn aside from birth. Liars go astray as soon as they are born. Their venom is like that of a snake, like a deaf serpent that does not hear, that does not respond to the magicians or to the skilled snake charmer. O God, break the teeth in their mouths. Smash the jawbones of the lions, O Lord. Let them disappear like water that flows away. Let them wither like grass. Let them be like a snail that melts away as it moves along. Let them be like stillborn babies that never see the sun. Before the kindling is even placed under your pots, he will sweep it away along with both the raw and cooked meat. The godly will rejoice when they see vengeance carried out. They will bathe their feet in the blood of the wicked. Then observers will say, yes, indeed, the godly are rewarded. Yes, indeed, there is a God who judges in the earth. Again, as we've said earlier, even though the first 41 Psalms were always attributed to David, in many cases we still have many carryovers, and so some of these we don't know who they were writing, but this, and we don't know why David is moved to this. The technical term, this is what you call an imprecatory psalm, which means asking God to deal judgment, God to deal vengeance on the enemies of him, the nation of Israel, and in fact, when you think about it, the enemies of God himself. And for David, he really is expressing an outrage about the injustice that he sees, and he appeals to God to send righteous judgment against this corruption that he's seeing. And that the flip side of that, while these evil people are being dealt with, that in fact there is a vindication available for the righteous ones that are there that David is thinking about, that David is trying to get a handle for what God is doing for him. And you look at as David relates these themes, if you will, that he seems to, it's very colorful. He says some really stark and shocking things, and that made me think about another psalm which we probably won't get to, but that he sees God's judgment in a stark, amazing illustration, and that he relates that there is moral accountability, and that if we in fact look at how David replaces and talks about that, there are many places, of course, in the New Testament that would also illustrate and relate the things that we see here in Psalm. And the first thing that David points out is that the corruption that is bothering him are in fact within the leadership of the nation of Israel, which I'm thinking about that, many times he's blind to what's going on. These things are happening, and he's totally unaware. We do see, as we've seen in previous Psalms, that some individuals that David has brought before the Lord and asked God to deal judgment to them. But in this case, he's talking about the leaders. Now, who are these leaders? Are they just the leaders in the temple? The high priest, those of Aaron's sons, perhaps the Levites? Could be some of those in his own group who are maybe generals, leaders. I don't know. There's very little we know about the structure of the leadership in the nation of Israel. We know that he had sent groups and armies and troops in different areas, knowing of course that they had military leaders, but did they have any kind of economic, social, governmental leadership? I don't know. I would tend to think they would, because obviously as David conducted his campaigns, they needed a financial support. I'm not saying that they necessarily had taxes, but I don't know. There seemed to be those who were in authority. And when you think about it, if I'm an individual that has the ability to draw funds, there's a great temptation in that part of the world, and that even today, you give someone a lot of money that's passing through their hands, it's really, hard to, for every dollar brought in, that every dollar would go out, have a tendency to disappear. And so I think that may be one of the things that we see. And David says right off, he says, do you indeed speak righteousness? And he's questioning God. Now, he's not denying it, but in his mind, he's refreshing what he thinks. And God loves being reminded of who he is. And so he says, do you indeed speak righteousness? Well, of course he does, and David knows that. And God knows that David knows that. But he's using that as an introduction to his desire for God to deal with these bad people. He says, do you speak righteousness? Speaking of the congregation, do you judge uprightly? You who are the leadership of men, are you doing the same thing that God does? And I think he's saying no, they don't. That they don't elevate the truth and righteousness of God's commandments in a consistent manner. And I think that might be, so he really wants to confront those. Now, I don't know whether, most people, if someone is speaking badly in my group, my surrounding, my first thought is, well, he's not talking about me. I'm not the bad guy. It's this guy or that guy or this person over here. And that may be a danger when you think about it, because when we see how God gives things, he says to us in his word, there is a real tendency to say, well, it surely doesn't mean me. I'm all right. I'm pretty good. Maybe. I don't know. But he is elevating the fact that these individuals were violent, that they were doing horrible things. I have no clue what they might have been. Obviously, and we see in many places in Scripture where gifts and support is not given equally. There were always problems with widows not being supported properly, even into the New Testament. And children, orphans, that happens. If we look at Acts, of course, there was a big complaint from the Gentile Christians that their widows and orphans weren't being taken care of, just like the Jewish widows and orphans were. And that's why, of course, they selected the 7 deacons, if you will. So, but David recognizes that, and I think as he relates this, I think we can learn from what David is saying. We know that God sees and that he judges both the heart and the actions of those who are in authority. And that this evil, this injustice will in fact be exposed. And that was one of the purposes of David writing this. And I question in my mind, well, he's the king. Why wasn't or couldn't or didn't David deal with these injustices? Did he think he didn't have the ability? Didn't he think that there were those who would support him? Maybe he felt that these things were happening, that were in secret, and he wasn't one of the ones that knew who was responsible. I don't know, but you would think that gee, I'm the guy, I'm the big cheese in the block. I should be able to deal with this. But I don't know how many people were in the nation of Israel at that time. Millions, And when you think about it, David probably said, "I'm just one man." Whereas if I put these problems into God's hands, then I know that he will take charge. And whether or not he himself would see a resolution of these difficulties, but in fact he would know that God would in his own good time be one who would in fact deal with those. And he talks about just how bad they were. He says, these wicked people, in this translation, were estranged from the womb. They were separated from the moment they were born, that their nature was set so that they would be evil people and do those evil things. And so he kind of says, these people are inherently corrupt. They're deaf to the truth, and they are resistant to being corrected. And he uses this term, and I don't know to what he was referring. He talks about these snakes being deaf, to the snake handler, the charmer's abilities. Now, I don't know whether he was actually saying they were really deaf, but they were ignoring it. And when you think about it, if people are ignoring the correction that's for them and for us, it's the same thing as being deaf, whether they really were or not. So that, in my mind, it's not saying he was incorrect because of what he thought they knew or didn't know, but in fact that's in the actual result was they turned a deaf ear, as we would recognize to say. And so I think in David's mind, you think these things are they're deeply rooted and they're resistant to any human persuasion, and we know that, until God breaks through the stony hearts of men and women, of course, and there's no conviction, possibly, and Paul says that in Romans 3, and of which we said where Paul says, there's no one righteous, no, not one. And so David, in seeing the outcome, not knowing necessarily the individuals that were causing these difficulties, he says, God, break their teeth. And that's very vivid, very powerful. In that part of the world, they had lions, they had alligators. I don't know what they had, but the teeth were the things that were really causing the problems. And he uses this metaphor, and I always have fun about this snail melting away. They commonly thought that's where all this was coming from. But if you really think about it, there's not a restoration. Eventually, they're going to run out of the fluid that's in them. So practically, there probably would be one who are melted away. And so we recognize that. But David, in his comments and his desire for God's justice, I think in his mind, and I think we should recognize it, that in fact, most often and more times, that God's justice may not always be immediate. We've always gone through history. Why do the wicked succeed? In their eyes, they're being successful. But David recognizes that your justice will be inevitable and total. And by that, we could say, well, okay, I want to be one who exerts this vengeance on these evil people. But then we recognize, no, God's the God of vengeance. We'll talk about that in a minute. But he does say that the righteous will rejoice when he sees God's vengeance taking place. Now, I almost want to take that when to make it the word if, because you may not ever see it. And so, David is, saying some really difficult things, but he does say that in God's plan, there will be a moral order that will be restored, and that justice will be done, and the righteous will be vindicated. And I think, looking how the New Testament reflects on these things, we talked about the Romans passage, but later on in the Romans, it's Paul tells those who are receiving his letter, he says, do not take vengeance, but leave room for God's wrath. For it is written, it is mine to avenge, I will repay, says the Lord. So, boy, sometimes I really want to get involved. I really want to see it straightened out. But God's plan, that's not how it's supposed to be done. And we look at some of the things that the Lord said in his earthly ministry. Matthew chapter 23, Jesus interacting with the Pharisees. He called them whitewashed tombs. That's pretty stark. He looks beautiful from the outside, but the inside is a bunch of dead man's bones. God cleans the outside of the cup. God who created the cup cleaned both outside and inside. So I think we want to relate to that. And of course, in Luke, we see one of my favorite passages, and we see this widow bugging the devil out of this judge. Says, I will in fact be the one. I don't want to help this woman, this widow, but because she's persistent, that is in fact how we see God's justice. And I use that to illustrate the passage in Genesis where here we had Jacob wrestling the angel, and the God told him, this is, you won. How can you beat God? But he won. And God honored his desire to resolve that situation. And it carries all the way through the New Testament, talking about how these things happen. When we finally get to what we discussed recently in Revelation, he says, where the martyrs who had been killed were crying out to God, says, how long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood. And this is almost the same thing that David is saying here. And I think we finally see that in Revelation 19, where we finally see God's victory, followed, of course, by the judgments that we see in Revelation 20. So, if we've kind of lumped this whole psalm together and try to understand how it interacts with us as believers in the New Testament, I think that even though we see a lot of things going on, and we talked about some of the things that are concerns and our prayer requests, that that even though there is evil and there is injustice, that we can be confident that it will not prevail, it will not last, it will not have eternal effects, because God is the righteous judge. And as we view these things and how we are perhaps recipients or even distributors of some of these injustices, I think we know that God in this psalm, and we look at it, that there is an importance to have an integrity in leadership for God's people. And that once we have this, and that we know that God hates corruption, evil in leadership, that in fact He will be the one who takes charge and resolve it in all our little situations. And David's framed this whole psalm, in a kind of a lament, and that it shows his faith and his bold appeal, if you will, that God would in fact intervene divinely in the face of this evil that's just burrowed its way like a tick. It's just there. It's gone deep, and we just sometimes don't have a way to get it out, but we know that God in fact will do that. And when we think about it, again, as we said before, Psalm says in the last part, it says, surely there is a God who judges on earth. And I think that's real comforting, because once we recognize that, there is great, great comfort in that whole process. And it's really a bold prayer, even though it's stark in many cases. It really doesn't hold back. And as he is looking at this injustice around him, the leaders who are corrupt, and these people who lie and harm and ignore truth, he does the right thing. As we said, he had the ability to rectify these things, but he asked God to intervene. And he really doesn't sugarcoat his anger and his distress of what was gone. He wants justice, and he wants it now. But wanting and getting is another story to think about. So for us, when we look at the situation in our world and things seem, upside down, and the wicked prosper and the righteous people suffer, and sometimes those who are in authority misuse their power, we can be confident in this, that God knows. Nothing is hidden from Him. And that even though David is crying out for this, a personal revenge, but he's not doing that. He's actually crying for God's righteous justice, not to help him have this revenge. So, sometimes reading this, it seems, so stark, has a lot of strong language. It's really tough for us to see that. But I think we could say one thing: it's honest. He's really speaking his heart, what was on his mind, what was bothering him, and that he was confident that God could handle. In fact, we could be confident that God can handle our cries in reflecting on the injustice in the world, and even when sometimes we might say it, and it is in fact strong. And so I think we could recognize that. And Luke talked about, will not God bring about justice for His chosen ones? And that's comforting.
Well, that's God's justice. That's not. I don't know why we should rejoice in God's vengeance. I mean,
well,
you always think what goes around comes around.
Well, let me see if I can flip that a little bit. If it's God's will, we should always rejoice in God's will being completed. Yes? And maybe I'm wrong. If we see God's will fulfilled, and in part of that will is vengeance. Yes, I could see where you're saying, boy, I'd hate to see, awful things happen to people. But if it's God's will, I mean, look at Jericho. There were some little children. Sodom and Gomorrah. There were, yes, there weren't 10 righteous men there, but there were children.
Look at what happened last night, yesterday. There was a lot of people killed. But I look at it this way. If they were Christians, they're in paradise today. They're in a better place than being here. And it's hard to look at sometimes.
I think that, speaking to what Kevin is saying, the sorrow of the circumstances that bother you, it's not so much what was happening, but it's sorrow in the fact that it had to get that far along. If these bad things happen, then where was I with those things? Is it possible that there are things that I could have done that would have saved that individual? Think about those poor sailors on the boat with Jonah.
Yeah.
They were, I'm not going to say innocent, but they were unbelievers, but they were recipients of God's judgment and chastisement on one man, and they didn't know who it was at first. And they still didn't want to throw him overboard, but that was God's will.
If you're a good-natured person, you don't want to see bad things happen to anybody.
That's true.
I mean,
and that's a challenge. Yeah, you're right.
Even to Attila the Hun. I mean,
I think of like Caiaphas, who put Jesus on trial and called him a blasphemer. I wouldn't want to be Caiaphas at the judgment. It's not going to be a good thing for him at all. He was a God hater, even though he put a facade on that he loved God. He didn't.
Yeah.
He loved himself.
But would you want to see bad things happen to him because of that?
I leave it to God.
Yeah,
God is going to take care of him.
That's what it says.
Yeah.
There, leave room. It says in Romans 12, do not take revenge, but leave room for God's wrath. So, do I rejoice in God's wrath? If it's His will, I should say yes. But I also don't rejoice because I might have had the ability to do things that would not require or demand God's justice.
Yeah, well, the way my Bible reads is, the righteous shall rejoice when they see his vengeance, and he shall wash his feet in the blood of the wicked.
That is, can't argue, but that's pretty bold.
Yeah, well, that's pretty harsh.
Wash his feet in the blood of his wicked.
Pretty harsh.
It's just, and it's tough. I mean, I
never
don't.
said it was going to be roses and sunshine every day.
That's right too.
It's not all kumbaya.
Even believers go through trials.
Look at
and
Look what happened to
But
Moses.
this is David saying
Because he
this.
didn't do what he was
Yes,
told
but
to
God
do.
put His thumb down.
Yeah,
So
And David had a heart after God.
yeah.
So, yeah.
So should I rejoice? But that says they do.
Yeah.
The righteous rejoice in seeing God's vengeance. Maybe because it would reverse the evil that they were doing. If I see somebody beating on a child on the street, let's pretend that I'm God. This man's abusing this little child. I go over there and knock that guy down. The rejoicing is not that I knocked him down, but he stopped beating that child. That may be our approach.
I don't know, it just says rejoice in the vengeance of God.
It's tough.
So when I think of vengeance, I think of somebody's going to get theirs.
Yeah.
And
we've talked about this, but I don't rejoice but if the point is, I think what we could honestly think about, the greatest part of rejoicing is that God's will is fulfilled, and that His perfect plan is accomplished. And sometimes, as David said, it's brutal. It's violent.
If somebody violently murdered your wife and they went to trial and they got the death penalty, would you be happy about that, or would you, like, or your grandchild?
Well, you know what? It's hard for me to wish ill will on anybody. I mean, I just don't have that in me.
But if they were like not even like, sometimes when people do things like that, they have a come to Jesus moment and they're very sorrowful and sad for what they did and are ashamed. But there's a lot of them who stand trial like,
They don't
I don't care.
Yeah.
It was just a person. It doesn't matter. I would feel better that they got what was coming to them personally, because it was my loved one. I mean,
That's what funny.
and that's the human heart too. I mean, it's like,
And
why
I,
should they walk
I don't
when
care.
my person can't do anything? I
and,
mean,
and I have a hard and fast rule about judging anybody.
Well,
I
here's
just do not judge people. I just, even though they, if I'm working with somebody, they stink a little bit, I'm not gonna say, hey, you're going to hell because you smell bad.
yeah. Does someone help me remember the scripture? Does it not say somewhere in the New Testament, "Do not rejoice in the death of the ungodly"?
Yeah, because they don't have a chance.
They had a chance.
They had a chance, but after they're gone, it's over with.
Yeah. I
And
think
that's the same way I look at this when God's vengeance. That I'm not really sorry for God's vengeance, but for the people that they did this stuff, and here they are, lost forever.
yeah.
Well, you can be sorry because of those people being not Christians and their soul is lost. But I mean,
I
can't be
guess-
sorry that
Well, think about this. Think about this. We all have individuals that we had interaction with, and many have died and gone into eternity. And that's one of my biggest regrets and sorrows is that I did not have the boldness to share the gospel with that person. That I did not give him or her an opportunity to change their lives. Yes, good people passed. Think about that. Ariana, here she's 16 and she was a believer.
or you did have the chance to, but you didn't have enough time to fully see it through. That's, to me, that's worse than thinking about sharing with somebody and not sharing, but sharing with them and not following through to the end.
Yeah, we'll never come to a resolution to some of these things that have been said, but I have a few ask myself questions. Am I willing to entrust justice to God? Or do I try to take it into my own hands? For those things that I have the ability to rectify, am I willing to step back and let God do it? I think that would be a big one. I would also
What kind of things are you talking about, though?
well,